Hello there, and welcome to Just About Earth, the part of YouTube where we let curiosity move at a sleepy, end-of-the-day pace. No rush, no pressure, just a quiet stretch of time where you can let your shoulders drop while your mind wanders a little. Tonight, we're drifting toward a place older than almost any story humans tell. A place where stone meets sky, where heat moves across the desert like a slow tide, and where one simple question has lingered for centuries. What if the pyramids are only the visible part of something much bigger? Not just bigger as in taller or wider, but bigger in meaning, in design, and in the quiet past that might still be tucked beneath the sand. What if those sharp triangles we've grown used to seeing are just the tip of a much deeper structure, physical or symbolic, that continues down into the earth? Before we follow that thought, I want to ask you the little question that always makes this feel more like a shared space than just a video. Where are you listening from tonight, and what time is it for you right now? I like imagining that as you hear this, you're in your own small bubble, a bedroom, a couch, a night shift break room, the back of a bus, while someone else is listening hours ahead or behind you. All of us scattered across the world, briefly overlapping in the same stream of ideas. Different clocks, same moment. If this kind of slow exploration helps you unwind, or you like having something calm to fall asleep to, it genuinely helps if you tap like or subscribe. It tells the algorithm that this quiet niche might be worth sharing with other people who need the same soft company. No obligation. This is fully eyes optional and judgment-free. You don't need any background in archaeology to be here. You don't need to remember pharaohs, dynasties, or technical terminology. You don't even have to stay awake all the way to the end. All you really need is a bit of curiosity and maybe a soft spot for things that have outlived entire civilizations. The pyramids have a way of stirring that feeling even in people who normally don't care about ancient history at all. We're used to seeing them as something we already understand. They're in textbooks, documentaries, travel vlogs, bright stone against brighter sky, tourists at their feet. In that familiar image, they almost feel finished, filed away in the explained folder in your mind. The pyramids? Sure, I know what those are, but what we carry around are mostly the postcard angles, the parts above ground, the camera-friendly faces of structures that have been slowly sinking into their landscape for thousands of years. Tonight, I like to gently redirect your attention away from the sunlit surfaces and let it drift downward, under the limestone blocks, into the plateau they sit on, and then a little deeper still into the bedrock itself. Not in a dramatic, horror movie way, more like dimming the lights and lowering a lantern down a quiet stairwell, just to see how far it goes. For more than a century, people have been digging around the pyramids, cutting tunnels beneath them, and more recently, scanning and mapping the rock below with modern instruments. And even with all that effort, most of what lies under them is still uncertain. Sometimes those scans show cavities where there weren't supposed to be any. Passages that were assumed to be short show up as longer, curling further than the simple diagrams suggest. Rooms appear in the data in places where no rooms were predicted. Every so often, a new survey quietly reminds researchers that the ground beneath Giza doesn't always behave like a single, solid block of stone or a straightforward construction site. We're not rushing toward big reveals here. Think of this more like walking through a museum just after closing. The crowds are gone, the lights are softer, and your footsteps echo a little. Not because anything is wrong, but because everything is still. If you picture the pyramids under a starry sky, they stop feeling like only buildings and start feeling like patient participants in a very long conversation between humans, stone, and the night. They watch languages appear and disappear, empires rise and fall. Everything we say about them is modern compared to the time they've already spent just existing. Underneath them, the bedrock is older still. You can almost sense that age if you imagine resting your palm on one of the stones. It doesn't feel like touching a monument that needs your attention. It feels more like leaning against a wall that has been there so long it barely notices you. People often ask why the pyramids hold our attention so stubbornly when, on paper, the story seems simple: giant tombs, impressive engineering, mystery mostly solved. Maybe it's a precision, those angles, those alignments, all achieved without machinery. Maybe it's the fact that they're still standing while so many other grand works of the ancient world have vanished. But there's also something quieter, The pyramids hide things, not with secret levers and dramatic trapdoors, but in a way any very old place hides itself over time. Sand piles up around foundations, edges wear down, chambers settle, crack, fill with rubble or get sealed off. What stays visible is only the outline. What isn't visible is everything else. And our minds are very good at being gently obsessed with everything else, especially late at night when the rest of the world finally quiets down. Some researchers suspect that what we see on the surface might be just one layer of a much larger system. Not just structures that rise into the air, but structures that extend downward. Rooms linked to other rooms, straight-cut corridors in the rock, natural caves that have been trimmed and shaped so subtly that you only notice the intention when you look closely at the angles. There are old accounts from the 1800s of explorers wandering through underground halls, so big their torchlight couldn't quite find the far wall. Some of those stories are almost certainly exaggerated, but not all of them can be brushed aside entirely. Even modern seismic surveys have flagged areas beneath the plateau that behave strangely, as if there are open spaces where, on a simple blueprint, you'd expect solid stone. That doesn't mean there's a vast hidden city under the sand. A calmer way to picture it is this. Imagine being told your house has 2 bedrooms and a hallway, and then years later discovering that, behind one plain wall, there's a small extra room no one mentioned. The house hasn't turned into a castle. The floor plan has just become a little more complicated than you thought. So as we start the slow descent into what might lie beneath the pyramids, try to hold the idea gently, the way you'd hold a warm mug in your hands. No urgency, no pressure to land on a theory. Just a soft, lingering question. What if the pyramids we see are only the top of the story, the visible caps on a design that continues quietly downward into the earth in ways we're only just beginning to sense? When most of us picture pyramids, we see that simple, iconic image. Vast triangles rising out of pale sand, cutting cleanly into the sky. Huge, yes, but somehow still contained, like they only occupy the space we can see in a photograph. A neat shape sitting on the surface of the desert. What we forget is how much has happened around and under those shapes. For well over a century, people have dug trenches, carved access tunnels, and more recently, sent waves of sound and energy through the ground to scan what lies below. And somehow, even with all that effort, the picture under the surface is still blurry. In those scans, cavities show up in places where nobody expected them. Areas that should be solid rock sometimes behave as if they're hollow. Passages that were assumed to be short appear to extend farther than the standard diagram suggests. Every now and then, a new survey quietly introduces a fresh void into the conversation, a word that sounds dramatic, but in these studies just means, here's a space we didn't know about yet. None of that means hidden cathedrals buried deep underground. It just means that the simple mental model most of us carry, pyramid above, solid block of rock below, isn't entirely accurate. The ground under Giza is more complicated, more layered, and more full of little surprises than the flat drawings in textbooks ever let on. But we're not here to sprint toward revelations. There's something oddly respectful about approaching the pyramids slowly, as if you're not just visiting a famous site, but joining a conversation that started thousands of years ago and never really stopped. In your mind, picture them at night instead of in bright daylight. No tour buses, no crowds, just stone silhouettes against a sky full of stars that human beings have been staring at since long before the first blocks were cut. Entire worlds have risen and collapsed while these structures stayed in place. Empires, belief systems, languages, everything you've heard about the pyramids is contemporary compared to their age. And they in turn sit on bedrock that is older still. When you imagine all of that stacked together, stars, stone, time, you can almost feel the weight of it, not as something oppressive, but as something steady, like leaning against an old wall that doesn't need your attention. It just is. People often ask, what is it about the pyramids that keeps pulling us back? Maybe it's the precision, that almost unreal accuracy in angle and alignment. Maybe it's a survival record, staying upright while so many ancient wonders turn to dust. But part of it, I think, is the simple fact that they hide things, not in a movie trap, Lost Temple kind of way, but in the way anything old hides itself over time. Sand drifts up and fills cracks. Open spaces collapse or get blocked. Walls decay, edges soften, entrances disappear. What we see is a kind of outline, a cleaned-up profile of structures that have spent thousands of years sinking into their own landscape. Everything else, the awkward parts, the unfinished parts, the parts that were never meant to be seen, slips out of view. And the human mind is very good at lingering on whatever slips out of view, especially at night, when everything else quiets down. Some researchers think the pyramids are just one visible layer of a much larger complex that extends down into the ground. Not a single basement, not a tidy map of secret rooms, but networks. Rooms connected to other rooms, narrow corridors carved with surprising precision, passageways that start out looking like natural caves until you notice the cuts are too straight, the corners too intentional. Back in the 1800s, a few explorers wrote about descending into underground spaces near Giza, halls so large that their torchlight didn't quite reach the far walls. Their descriptions sound dramatic, and they probably were. But buried in the exaggeration are hints that not everything below the surface is small or simple. And when modern surveys point to zones with a rock axe as if they're open spaces, it's hard not to hear a faint echo of those older stories. Still, this isn't a thriller. If anything, it's closer to walking through a museum after hours. The noise is gone. The air feels still. Your steps sound a little louder because everything else has gone quiet. That's the mood that suits the pyramids at night. The temperature drops. The day's heat bleeds away from the stone, and the desert wind starts moving grains of sand so gently you'd miss it if you weren't paying attention. In that atmosphere, thinking about what might lie beneath isn't about danger. It's about scale. The scale of what humans chose to build, and maybe the scale of what we haven't fully recognized yet. The idea that the pyramids might be the upper portion of something bigger isn't a brand new thought. Historians, geologists, and engineers have dipped into that possibility for decades. It just doesn't make headlines very often because it doesn't fit well into a single clean sentence like, "The pyramids are tombs," or "The pyramids were built for X." We like simple explanations. One structure, one purpose. But the more you study the Giza Plateau as a whole, the harder it is to see the pyramids as standalone objects. They start to look more like peaks in a much larger design, part of a landscape scale plan that involved not just stacking stone upward, but preparing, shaping, and cutting into the ground itself. Even the bedrock tells a story. Around Giza, the surface shows signs of being leveled, trimmed, and trenched in ways that don't always line up neatly with the known construction phases of the pyramids we see today. Some cuts look older, like the ground was prepared for something long before the visible structures reach their current form. In certain areas, the plateau feels more carved than natural. Elsewhere, it looks reinforced, as if the builders weren't just thinking about the weight resting on top, but about what might exist beneath, or what needed to be reached beneath. Some ancient texts even hint at underground regions linked to the pyramids. They're written in symbolic language, not in structure manual detail, so you can't use them like a treasure map. But it's hard not to wonder whether those symbols were built on memories of real places that slowly blurred into myth. Before we jump to images of vast hidden worlds, it helps to remember something very ordinary. Ancient societies built downward a lot. Tombs sank deep into the earth. Temples often had underground portions. Storage rooms, ritual spaces, administrative areas. It was completely normal to place them below a main building instead of inside it. In that context, the thought that the pyramids might sit above more extensive subterranean features isn't wild at all. It would actually fit patterns seen across multiple ancient cultures. And when modern scanning techniques pick up repeated anomalies under the plateau, not just one or two, but multiple signals showing shapes that line up in suggestive ways beneath different structures, it doesn't prove anything dramatic. It just raises a fresh set of questions. And questions are where real exploration starts. Not with loud assumptions, but with a quiet acknowledgement that surfaces rarely tell the whole story. The pyramids themselves hint at this. Their size, their uncanny alignment, the way their internal passages line up so carefully. Nothing about them feels accidental. They were built with a kind of deliberateness that's hard to imagine stopping exactly at ground level. If you were designing something meant to survive thousands of years of earthquakes, erosion, and shifting sand, would you only build upward? Or would you try to anchor it deep, extending the design down into the ground so that everything visible and invisible work together as a single system? Even now, standing at the base of the Great Pyramid, you can feel the idea of weight in a way that's almost physical, even through a screen. Millions of stone blocks bearing down into the rock beneath. The ancient builders knew that pressure had to go somewhere. They knew the ground needed more than a flat scrape. It needed to be prepared, shaped, and reinforced. And when archaeologists look closely at that bedrock, they do find those preparations: flattened sections, step cuts, carved platforms. Some of those shapes make perfect sense purely as support. Others look like they were meant to be used, not just stood on. Their angles and layouts feel more like access points than simple reinforcement. So imagine, just for a moment, walking across the desert surface near Giza. You see sand, rock, maybe a rope barrier, or a scattering of tools left from a recent dig. Nothing dramatic. But beneath your feet, there could be rooms. Not in a fantasy sense, just in a practical, architectural way. Small spaces cut for reasons we don't yet know. Passages that connect one area to another. Shafts that drop to levels that haven't been fully explored because it's too risky to dig further. Those possibilities don't require secret societies or alien technology. They just hint that the ancient world was often more layered than the neat diagrams in our heads. The builders used the earth as part of their design. They cut into the plateau, worked with natural stone, and shaped the landscape as carefully as they shaped the structures sitting on top of it. The pyramids stand where they stand for reasons, and the ground beneath them, carved and altered, likely carries its own quiet logic, one that may still be waiting, in pieces, for us to understand. When you picture the desert around the pyramids, it's easy to imagine a big, empty backdrop, a flat stretch of sand with a few rocky patches. They're mainly to make the pyramids look dramatic. But once you start paying attention to how the land and the structures interact, something subtle shifts. The desert stops looking like scenery and starts feeling like part of the design. Because the pyramids don't just sit in that landscape. They use it. If you were standing right next to the Great Pyramid, looking up, its size would feel obvious and immediate. The blocks rise above you in huge steps, each one heavy enough that you instinctively understand why this thing has survived for so long. But something interesting happens when you walk away from it. Most buildings shrink in your perception as you get farther. They blend into the background, lose their shape against the horizon, and start to look small. The Great Pyramid doesn't really do that. You can be hundreds of meters away, and it still looks oddly present, as if it refuses to be pushed into the distance. The outline holds. The shape doesn't soften as much as you expect. There are only a few human-made structures in the world that manage that trick. Part of the effect comes from geometry. The desert around Giza isn't perfectly flat. It has small rises, shallow dips, ridges, and gentle slopes, all of which tend to confuse your sense of scale. But the pyramids cut through that complexity with clean, straight lines. Their faces form simple, sharp planes that your brain latches onto like a reference grid. Once that happens, everything else, the sand, the subtle curves of land, the low hills, fades into the background. The desert stops competing visually and starts framing the structures. You're left with an extremely simple scene: triangle, sky, ground. And in a scene that simple, the triangle wins every time. Even in photographs, this comes through. You can scroll past countless images taken from different angles, different distances, in different lighting, and the pyramids almost never look small. The simplicity of their geometry, combined with the uncluttered environment, makes them hold their presence in a way that's strangely consistent. Ancient builders didn't just rely on that basic shape, though. Archaeologists have found that the ground immediately around the pyramids has been carved, leveled, and shaped much more than it looks at first glance. There are artificial ledges, flattened platforms, and stretches of bedrock that were deliberately trimmed to create a kind of broad, low pedestal for each structure. Up close, these modifications don't jump out at you. They just look like rock. But from farther away, they have an important effect. They give the pyramids a stable visual base, a wide, subtle stage that lets them stand out against the natural slopes beyond. The land doesn't just hold the pyramids, it presents them. Then there's the orientation. The big pyramids at Giza are aligned with the cardinal directions with astonishing precision: north, south, east, west. That alignment isn't just symbolic or spiritual. It changes how the structures look from almost every angle. Because their sides are so precisely oriented, you almost never stumble into an awkward view. Walk around them from any direction and the lines stay balanced. One face might be in shadow while another catches a light, but the overall symmetry doesn't fall apart. There's no bad side where they suddenly look crooked or off. That's unusual. Many ancient structures have one primary viewpoint that makes them look their best. With the pyramids, the geometry works from pretty much everywhere. The landscape bends to their lines instead of the other way around. When you combine these factors, the simple shape, the carved platforms, the clean orientation, the empty desert, you get something subtle but powerful. Your brain loses the usual clues it uses to judge distance and size. There are no trees for comparison, no skyscrapers, no lampposts, no clutter, just stone and sand. In that emptiness, the pyramids become the only strong vertical forms for a long way in any direction. And when something stands alone like that, especially in a bare landscape, its scale gets magnified in your perception. It's the same reason a single mountain rising out of flat land can look more impressive than a taller peak buried in a range. Isolation makes objects feel bigger. People who visit often report that the pyramids almost seem to grow as they step back, the opposite of what should happen. Up close, the slope of the faces is so steep that it's hard to see the full outline. As you move away, your brain finally gets enough distance to read the whole shape at once. And there's this odd little moment when the structure clicks into focus and feels even more massive. The desert is helping with that. Its emptiness acts like negative space in the painting, allowing the pyramid geometry to show itself fully. All of this is just what we can see above ground. But the same careful relationship between land and architecture seems to continue below the surface. Geologists have noticed that the plateau is built from layers of limestone with different strengths. Some layers are hard and dense, forming natural ribs of strong rock. Others are softer, more easily eroded, and more suitable for cutting. When you look at maps of the bedrock and then overlay the pyramid locations, an interesting pattern appears. The pyramids sit on or near those harder, more supportive layers. That makes sense. If you're going to place millions of tons of stone somewhere, you want the ground beneath it to be as stable as possible. Those natural ribs act like built-in support beams in the earth. But there's another side to that geology. Softer layers of rock, especially in a place shaped long ago by water, are easier to dig through. If you were planning to carve chambers or corridors underground, or to create working spaces beneath the site during construction, this combination, hard layers for support, soft layers for excavation, would be almost ideal. In other words, the plateau doesn't just support building upward. It quietly invites building downward. Some studies suggest that natural formations under Giza form a kind of skeletal structure under the desert. Strong ridges of dense limestone surrounded by softer material. The pyramids appear to take advantage of those ridges for stability, while some of the known underground corridors and shafts seem to follow lines where the rock is easier to shape. That doesn't prove the existence of a giant hidden complex, but it does suggest that the same thoughtful integration we see above ground, geometry working with light, shape working with desert, might also exist below, with architecture working hand in hand with geology. Even the way the pyramids interact with sunlight adds to this layered impression. Over the course of a day, their shadows swing and stretch in slow, predictable arcs across the sand. In early morning and late afternoon, when the sun is low, the faces of the pyramids catch light in a way that makes them look taller, sharper. The contrast increases. Details stand out that were washed out at noon. If you've ever seen photos taken at sunrise or sunset, you know they look almost like different structures, more textured, more sculpted, more intense. Modern architects sometimes design buildings specifically to play with light like this. The ancient builders were doing it on a gigantic scale thousands of years ago. The simplicity of the pyramid shape hides a sophisticated understanding of how light, shadow, landscape, and structure can work together. And that consistency, across time of day, viewing angle and distance, is part of what makes these monuments feel so undeniably there. Now imagine the same minds who orchestrated that effect above ground applying their attention to what lay below. The same awareness of weight and support. The same understanding of how stone behaves. The same patience with cutting and shaping layers of rock. If their goal was to build something that would last through earthquakes, floods, eroding winds, and shifting sands, it makes sense that they would think in 3 dimensions, up into the sky and down into the earth. The pyramid you see might only be the most visible piece of that whole design. Not a secret city, not a hidden world in the dramatic sense, but a deeper structure, a system of carved bedrock, natural cavities, filled spaces, and reinforced layers that tie the visible stones to the geology beneath them. Seen that way, the idea that the pyramids are only part of something larger doesn't feel like a stretch. It feels like a calm extension of what they already do so well. Interact with their environment so precisely that the line between monument and landscape starts to blur, both above the sand and quietly below it. When people look at the pyramids, the natural instinct is to look up. Everything about their shape pulls your attention toward the apex, toward the sky, toward the idea of height and ascent. That upward pull is so strong that we almost forget there's another direction we could be thinking about. Down. The ground beneath the pyramids has been holding their weight for thousands of years, quietly doing its job while our attention stays fixed on the stones above. And because we rarely picture what's under them, that entire part of the story becomes a kind of quiet frontier. Not dramatic, not glowing with secrets, just unexplored, at least in our imagination. The first thing to understand is that the Giza Plateau is not just a flat slab of rock waiting passively under pyramids. It's a layered, uneven, geologically complicated base. Some sections rise in natural ridges. Others dip into softer pockets shaped long ago by water. There are subtle slopes, fractures, seams, and zones where the rock transitions from strong to fragile over just a few meters. To ancient builders, those differences mattered a lot. They weren't guessing when they chose a specific plateau. They didn't just look for a spot with a nice view of the Nile and start hauling blocks. They were experts in stone, quarrying it, carving it, watching it crack, watching it hold. Over generations, they learned which layers stayed stable and which ones crumbled, which kind of rock carried weight well, and which ones gave way under pressure. So when they looked at Giza, they weren't just picking a location. They were choosing a foundation that could be shaped, stepped, and carved to serve a long-term purpose. We tend to imagine a foundation as a simple block or a poured slab. Clean, uniform, straightforward. The base of the pyramids isn't like that. The builders cut into the natural rock, creating steps and terraces in the bedrock itself. Some parts of the pyramid don't sit on placed blocks at all. They rest directly on shaped limestone that was carved to support them. That means the ground under the pyramids isn't separate from the architecture. It is the
Archaeologists have
If you picture
discovered
workers
that the
thousands of years
ground
ago cutting into that
immediately
stone,
around the pyramids
it's tempting to
was
imagine them
carefully
just flattening
carved,
areas and smoothing
leveled,
surfaces,
and shaped.
so they'd have something level to build on. But the more archaeologists uncover, the more complex the picture becomes. They found trenches carved into the bedrock that extend beyond the visible footprint of the pyramids. Large rectangular depressions, long straight cuts, and outlines that echo the shape of the structures above, only in reverse, like shadows pressed into the ground. These features don't feel random. They look like the early sketch marks of something bigger, as if the builders were thinking not only about what would stand above the surface, but also about what might eventually exist beneath it. Over time, a lot of those carved features were buried. Sand drifted in. Debris from later activity filled the cuts. Some areas may have been deliberately backfilled once they were no longer needed. But when modern excavations and surveys reveal them again, patterns start to appear. Certain trenches line up with internal corridors. Cuts in the bedrock match the positions of shafts. In some places, depressions correspond suspiciously well with underground anomalies picked up by modern scans. It's like finding faint pencil lines under a painting. Ghosts of earlier planning stages still faintly visible if you know where to look. It's important not to jump from pattern to huge underground city. The spaces below the pyramids aren't all enormous caverns and echoing halls. Many of them, where they exist, are probably small, narrow, or partially filled with rubble. But in this context, size isn't the main point. Intention is. Even a small chamber, if it's deliberately positioned, tells you something about the way the builders thought. A channel cut into the floor isn't just a random groove. It suggests drainage or measurement or some kind of functional purpose. A shaft that drops straight down and then stops, that's a decision, not an accident. Ancient writers who visited Egypt long after the pyramids were built sometimes mention underground regions associated with the site. Their accounts, filtered through layers of myth and symbolism, aren't reliable maps. But the very fact that underground features were part of the story at all suggests that people knew, even then, that the plateau didn't end at the surface. Fast forward to modern times, ground-penetrating radar, seismic surveys, microgravity studies, thermal imaging. Researchers have pointed almost every tool they have at Giza. The results are cautious but consistent. They show anomalies beneath the pyramids. Some of those anomalies are small voids. Others are elongated shapes, like possible tunnels. A few appear as larger, irregular spaces that don't match the clean lines of known chambers. Scientists tend to be careful when talking about these findings. A void can be many things: a natural cavity, a fracture zone, a crack between rock layers. Not every anomaly is a room. Not every hollow is a hidden structure. But when multiple techniques point to similar shapes in similar places,
many visitors report
the idea
a
that the
strange
ground is just one
experience.
solid mass gets
The
harder to
pyramids
support.
seem to
The
grow
bedrock
larger
itself makes the
as they
job
step
tricky.
back.
The limestone
The
layers
exact
vary in density and
opposite
composition,
of what you'd expect.
which means they can scatter or absorb signals in unpredictable ways. That's why one scan rarely settles anything by itself. It's more like building a picture out of overlapping shadows. Even with all those challenges, surveys have repeatedly shown that the plateau contains more hollow spaces than you'd expect if it were just a clean block of stone. Some are shallow, some are deep, some hug known structures. Others sit farther away, in zones that don't line up neatly with anything on the surface. Excavations have turned up something else. Tunnels whose walls are too straight, too smooth, too aligned to be written off as natural cracks. Shafts with cleanly cut sides that drop down before bending or ending in block sections. Small chambers with entrances now clogged by rock and sand. A few of these were recorded by early explorers in the 19th century, long before modern archaeology tightened its methods. They described descending into underground spaces that were larger, cleaner, or more precisely cut than they expected. Not every description has held up. Some were embellished, but not all of them evaporated under scrutiny. Enough features have been confirmed or rediscovered that the older reports start to read less like wild fantasy and more like clumsy first takes on something real but poorly understood. All of this leads to a simple, grounded question. Why create so many spaces under and around a site like this? Some likely had basic practical functions. Storage areas, work tunnels used during construction, test cuts to check the quality of the stone. Others may have been connected to burial practices, rituals, or symbolic layouts that make more sense in the religious worldview of the time than they do to us now. And then there's a possibility that some of these spaces were part of a larger architectural plan. Not in a sensational, hidden complex sense, but in a structural one. A multi-layer design in which the plateau itself, with all its natural cavities and carved modifications, was as much a part of the project as the visible stones. Imagine standing at the base of the Great Pyramid and knowing the ground under you isn't just rock, but a layered system of cut surfaces, trenches, shafts, and natural hollows, some older than the pyramid, some carved during its construction, some may be added later as needs changed. You don't have to imagine sci-fi technology for that to make sense. You just have to imagine planners who thought in stages that spanned decades or generations. The more you look at it that way, the more the site starts to feel three-dimensional in a direction we rarely think about. Not just height, but depth. Not just stone stacked toward the sky, but stone reshaped as it sinks into the earth. And once you let your mind turn downward like that, the pyramids stop being only sharp silhouettes against the horizon. They become the visible tips of structures whose full story includes the ground beneath them, an archive of cuts, layers, and quiet choices that time is mostly hidden,
and
but not
shapeworks
completely
with
erased.
the landscape might
When we think about
also
the people who built the
exist below
pyramids,
ground,
it's easy to picture
with
one particular
architecture
scene.
working
Long
hand in
lines of
hand
workers in the
with
sun,
geology.
dragging huge blocks on sleds, ropes cutting into their hands, overseers calling out orders. It's a powerful image, and there's truth in it, but it's only one layer of the story. Behind that physical effort was another group we don't imagine as often: planners, designers, surveyors, people whose jobs started long before the first stone was moved. The more we learn about how these structures were built, the clearer it becomes that they weren't the result of trial and error or brute force alone. They came from planning, detailed, evolving planning. If you shift your focus from the laborers to the engineers, the pyramids start to look less like standalone monuments and more like parts of a big, multi-phase project. Look at the consistency in their layout. The base angles are deliberate.
Modern architects
sides
design
align with the cardinal
buildings to
directions
play
through
with
precision
light like
that
this,
impresses modern
but
surveyors.
the ancient
The internal
Egyptians were
passages
doing
follow
it
carefully chosen
thousands of
slopes
years
and
ago on a
orientations.
monumental scale.
Even small deviations inside the pyramid show signs of being corrected as the work progressed. That doesn't feel like guessing. It feels like measuring, checking, and adjusting as needed. Inside the Great Pyramid, there's evidence that the builders changed their minds at least once while construction was underway. They carved one chamber, then shifted focus to another, added passages, refined the layout. That might sound like chaos, but it's actually what happens in any complicated project. You start with a plan, you discover new constraints, and you refine. If anything, those mid-course adjustments make the builders look more sophisticated, not less. They weren't mechanically following a fixed script. They were thinking, responding, and updating as they went. That's engineering. What's especially striking is how well they understood geometry in a practical, hands-on way. They didn't write their math in the language we use today, but they knew how to use angles, straight lines, and proportions with impressive accuracy. They found true north without compasses. They laid out right angles using ropes and measured segments. They designed internal chambers that could survive under the weight of millions of tons of stone. And none of that could have worked properly if they had treated the ground beneath the pyramids as an afterthought. Modern engineers know that before you build anything big, you have to understand the site. You study the soil, the rock, the way water flows, the way the ground might shift. You run surveys. You map faults. You look for cavities. In their own way, ancient builders did the same thing. They didn't have electronic instruments, but they had experience. Centuries of watching stone behave under stress. At Giza, the pyramids don't just sit wherever there happen to be open space. Their positions line up with structural features in the bedrock. Those harder layers, those natural ridges, those zones of reliable stability. When you view the plateau from above, with geological information layered under the map of structures, you start to see a kind of logic emerge. The pyramids aren't scattered like random monuments. They sit where the ground is strongest. That suggests something like a blueprint, not a rolled-up paper plan with perfectly straight ink lines, but a mental and practical framework that extended across decades. We'll put the structures here because this part of rock can support them. We'll carve here because the zone cuts cleanly. We'll avoid this area because the stone is weak. You can see hints of that planning in the stones themselves. Many blocks in the pyramids are cut to consistent sizes, as if they were following a standard module. That kind of uniformity doesn't happen by accident. It makes construction easier because workers know exactly how each block will fit. It also hints at a standardized measuring system, a shared unit that works both at the quarry and at the building site. If the same units were used above and below ground, for chambers, shafts, trenches, and foundations, then the underground features weren't improvisations. They were part of the same measuring mindset. The hidden parts followed the same rules as the visible ones. Inside the Great Pyramid, the relieving chambers stacked above the king's chamber are a quiet example of this mindset. They were built not for show, but to manage weight. Massive granite beams redirect the pressure of the stone above, so the chamber below doesn't collapse. If those beams had been even slightly misplaced, the structure might have failed centuries ago. Instead, they've held steady for thousands of years. That kind of long-term reliability doesn't come from guesswork. It comes from an understanding of how forces move through stone, how weight travels, where pressure concentrates, how to give that pressure somewhere safe to go. In effect, the builders were doing structural engineering long before the term existed. And that's just inside a single pyramid. When you step back and look at the entire Giza complex, the Great Pyramid, the other main pyramids, the satellite pyramids, the causeways, the temples, a pattern of shared principles starts to show up. Alignments, repeated angles, similar relationships between height and base length, structures that line up with each other, as well as with the cardinal directions. It feels less like 3 separate construction projects and more like a long-running program guided by a consistent set of ideas. Now imagine adding underground features to that picture. Tunnels, shafts, carved chambers, shaped trenches in the bedrock. Some of those match the alignment of the structures above. Some sit under important points in the surface layout. Others trace straight lines that connect parts of the plateau we usually think of as separate. If the same people responsible for the precise geometry of the visible pyramids were also directing work underground, it would make sense that those hidden spaces would follow the same logic. Not random, not scattered, but aligned and measured with the same care. This doesn't mean the underground landscape is perfectly organized. Big projects always leave behind strange leftovers, half-finished passageways, spaces that get repurposed, areas that go out of use and get filled in. Modern buildings have those too. Service corridors, sealed rooms, stairwells that don't lead anywhere anymore. The pyramids likely have their own ancient equivalents. Some underground features might predate the final form of the pyramids, belong in the earlier construction phases, or abandoned ideas. Others might have been added later, as needs changed or rituals evolved. The result is a layered record of choices, some clear, some confusing, some no longer understandable at all. But underneath that complexity, you can still feel the presence of a plan. One place where that plan shows through is in the trenches carved into the plateau. Some of these trenches look like outlines, long rectangular cuts that mirror the shapes of the structures above them, like reverse blueprints etched into the stone. Others run like guidelines, marking alignments or defining working areas. If you imagine the plateau before any blocks were stacked, with those cuts visible in the open rock, the whole site starts to look like a giant drafting table. Lines and shapes carved directly into the bedrock, showing workers where to dig, where to build, where to leave solid stone alone. From that perspective, the underground world at Giza stops feeling mysterious and starts feeling methodical. It isn't necessarily a secret realm. It's part of a giant, multi-layered project where the land, the stones, the visible monuments, and the spaces below all follow variations of the same quiet logic. And the idea that the pyramids might just be the most obvious part of that bigger design, the part that sticks up into the light, begins to feel less like speculation and more like a natural extension of how carefully the builders seem to have thought. When most people imagine the inside of a pyramid, they picture something simple, a narrow entrance passage, a couple of chambers, maybe a tomb at the center, and then just solid stone stretching outward in every direction. That's a version most of us grew up with. A clean diagram on a white page, a few label rooms, some straight lines, and a reassuring idea that the rest is just rock. But as researchers started looking a little closer, that tidy picture began to fray at the edges. The real interiors are more complicated. There are rooms where the simple models say there shouldn't be rooms, tunnels that go further than they're supposed to, and features cut into the bedrock that don't line up neatly with any known phase of construction. It's not chaos, but it's also not the neat box with a hallway layout we like to imagine. Take the Great Pyramid, for example. Deep below the main structure is a so-called subterranean chamber, cut straight into the bedrock. At first glance, it looks crude compared to more famous kings and queens' chambers higher up. The walls are rough, the ceiling uneven, the floor carved with odd recesses and shallow channels. For a long time, the easy explanation was that this room was abandoned, an early attempt at a burial chamber that the builders changed their mind about. But the more people examine it, the harder that simple explanation became to hold on to. The recesses don't feel random. The cuts, while rough, still show intention. Some of the channels are straight and deliberate, not just hack marks from tools. If this were the only odd space, it would be easy to shrug off. But it's Just one example in a pattern. Above the king's chamber, for instance, there are several smaller, hidden spaces, the relieving chambers we mentioned earlier. For centuries, no one knew they were there because they were sealed off and never meant to be accessed once construction was finished. Their official purpose is structural. They help distribute weight and keep the chamber below from collapsing. That explanation makes sense. But you can also ask another question quietly alongside it. If they were purely functional, why build so many of them with such careful precision? Why seal them so thoroughly? Why give them such consistent dimensions when no one was supposed to see them? It doesn't mean there's a dramatic secret hidden in those answers. It just hints that, even in purely structural spaces, the builders kept applying the same careful rules: symmetry, alignment, standardized measurements. It's like seeing someone tidy the inside of a drawer no one else will ever open. It tells you something about how they think. As exploration continued, more unexpected details appeared. In the 19th century, early researchers found tunnels branching off known passages. Some ended abruptly. Others seemed to be filled in on purpose. A few were so narrow that they could only have been used during construction, perhaps for measurements or temporary access, never intended for regular use. Many modern diagrams don't bother to show these side features. They complicate the story. They make the layout less like a clean, singular design and more like a project that evolved over time, with test cuts, adjustments, and abandoned ideas still partially visible beneath the final plan. Then, in recent years, scanning technologies added another layer to the puzzle. Techniques like muon imaging and advanced thermal surveys detected a large void above the Grand Gallery in the Great Pyramid. Not a tiny crack, but substantial space, roughly the size of an entire chamber. It doesn't match any known part of the internal layout. It doesn't appear in older maps, and no one is completely sure what it's for. Some suggest it's another structural feature, a kind of buffer zone in the stone. Others suspect it might be a leftover stage of construction, part of an earlier idea for the internal layout that was later revised. What matters, for our quiet purposes tonight, is that it exists. It's real, and its existence gently nudges us away from that tidy mental model of a pyramid as a mostly solid block with a few well-understood corridors. The same goes for the other major pyramids. When researchers look at Khafre's pyramid, the one that appears to sit directly behind the Sphinx, they see similar hints of complexity. Density changes beneath its mass suggest possible cavities or tunnels. Some may be natural pockets in the limestone. Others show straight-line patterns that are harder to attribute to geology alone. Straight lines are unusual underground. Nature prefers irregular curves, jagged edges, uneven surfaces. When you start seeing repeated right angles or long, clean cuts, it's usually a sign that human hands have been at work. Around the Sphinx, early explorers reported shafts and passages that seemed to lead into the bedrock on the plateau. Some of these reports were overexcited. Others were careful. Later archaeological work confirmed at least a few underground features in that area. Not vast halls, but carved spaces and narrow tunnels that show someone at some time was working underneath the surface there. One especially intriguing example near the Great Pyramid is a deep shaft lined with carefully cut stone. It drops vertically before branching out or leveling off below. When it was first found, it was choked with debris. Clearing it revealed smooth walls and a thoughtful shape, but not a clear purpose. It doesn't fit neatly into known burial patterns. It doesn't behave like a simple ventilation route. It looks like part of a plan, but we're missing the rest of the drawing. Beneath the Menkaure Pyramid, there's a chamber that puzzled researchers for similar reasons. It's cleanly cut, lined with unusual stonework, and shaped in a way that doesn't match standard burial chamber designs. There are carved recesses in the floor that look like placeholders, for objects, for structures, for something, but nothing remains there now. No inscriptions, no obvious ritual indicators, just a carefully made and now empty space. There's something almost more unsettling about a perfectly cut, completely empty room than about one filled with artifacts. A cluttered room tells you what it was for. A bare one just raises questions. All of these features stray tunnels, unexpected shafts, empty chambers, unexplained voids, don't demand fantastical explanations. What they demand is patience. They suggest that the pyramids and the plateau weren't built in a single, clean step, but through layered decisions. Planning, revising, carving, filling, sealing. Think about any large modern project. Subway systems, skyscrapers, stadiums. They all have weird leftover spaces, maintenance corridors, sealed doors that no one uses anymore. Plans change midstream. Needs evolve. Techniques improve. Some paths get abandoned halfway. Others are completed but repurposed. The difference at Giza is that we're looking back across millennia without the original notes, diagrams, or conversations. The why behind many of those decisions evaporated a long time ago. What's left is stone, and stone doesn't explain itself. It just holds whatever shape it was given. So when we talk about the idea that the pyramids could be the visible parts of a larger system, we're not necessarily talking about grand secrets. We're talking about layers. Layers of planning. Layers of construction. Layers of natural geology and human modification overlapping each other. A tunnel that goes farther than expected isn't necessarily a hidden escape route. It might be a remnant of an earlier alignment. A shaft that stops abruptly might not be a trap. It might be part of a construction method that no one thought to document. A chamber with no inscriptions might not be mysterious on purpose. It might simply have been functional in a way that didn't require words on the wall. But the more these features show up, the more we find things that don't fit the simple diagrams. The harder it is to see the pyramids as self-contained structures. They start to feel like focal points within a three-dimensional environment that extends into the rock beneath them. You can think of it like walking through an old building and realizing that what you see, the hallways, the rooms, the staircases, is only part of the story. Above the ceiling there are beams, ducts, and crawl spaces. Below the floor there are foundation pipes, conduits. None of that is glamorous, but it's all part of the building. Giza might be the same way. The pyramids are the visible architecture. The underground features, the carved bedrock, the unexpected voids, the half-forgotten passages, are the substructure. Together, they make up a site that is physically larger and conceptually deeper than what we get from a postcard view. And as we keep following the slow path downward in our imaginations, it becomes less about finding a grand revelation and more about accepting a gentler truth. The pyramids were never just triangles in the sand. They were always part of a layered environment, one that stretches both into the sky we can see and into the stone we mostly can't. When people talk about the Giza Plateau, they almost always start with what's above it. The clean angles of the pyramids in the morning light, the long shadows stretching out in the evening, the way the structures seem to lean gently into the sky. But if you shift your attention downward instead of upward, the picture changes. The plateau isn't just a flat shelf holding the weight of stone. It's a layered, irregular structure in its own right, full of ridges, faults, and, in some places, open spaces. Those spaces, the natural hollows and pockets inside the rock, have quietly shaped both the landscape and the questions we ask about it. The geological story here starts long before any human thought of stacking limestone into a pyramid. Millions of years ago, the place we now know as desert was underwater. Over time, sediments settled, compacted, and turned into rock. Some layers became dense and strong. Others formed softer zones that could be carved by flowing water. As ancient seas shifted and retreated, water moved through the rock, slowly dissolving and reshaping parts of it.
You
that
run
process left
into new
behind what geologists
challenges
call
or
karst
come up with
features,
better ideas,
natural
and you
cavities, channels,
refine your
and voids
approach.
inside the limestone. Most of those spaces are small and irregular. A few are larger. Some connect loosely with others, like parts of a natural, incomplete underground lattice. Eventually the land rose, the water left, and the climate dried. The rocks stay behind, carrying those empty pockets inside it like quiet memories. If you walked across the plateau without knowing any of that, you'd see solid ground and endless sky. No hint that beneath your feet there might be layers of stone with tiny gaps, fractures, and hollow spaces. But those cavities are part of the geological fabric of the area, and their existence sets up a simple but important question. When ancient builders arrived here, how much of that hidden structure did they encounter? We know they understood stone. They worked with it constantly, cutting blocks, carving statues, shaping temples. They would have noticed areas where the rock rang differently under tools. where the ground sounded hollow, where cracks open more readily. They would have stumbled upon natural cavities, even if they didn't describe them in words that survive for us to read. Archaeologists have, in fact, found evidence that some natural caves or hollows beneath the plateau were modified. Rough, irregular walls smoothed out, ceilings trimmed, entrances widened or squared off. In other places, entirely new spaces were cut into zones where the limestone was soft enough to carve efficiently. Nature provided the starting shapes. Human hands refined them. This blend of natural and artificial isn't unusual in ancient construction. In many cultures, builders took advantage of caves, overhangs, and rock shelters instead of starting from scratch. But at a site as huge and symbolically important as Giza, those choices carry extra weight. Natural cavities become part of the broader architectural environment, whether intentionally or just as a side effect. One often mentioned example near the plateau is a major cavity not far from the Great Pyramid. Early explorers wrote about descending into a space that felt unexpectedly open for this kind of rock, a chamber with high ceilings, branching passages, and cool air trapped inside. Their descriptions aren't always exact, and memory can be dramatic, but modern surveys have confirmed the presence of voids in roughly the same area. Whether those voids match the old accounts perfectly or only partially, their existence shows that the plateau was never a solid, uniform block of stone. It's more like a layered cake with the occasional air bubble inside. As technology improved, microgravity surveys and seismic studies added to the picture. They often picked up small variations in density beneath the surface, places where the rock seems lighter, hinting at cavities or fractures. Some of these anomalies appear near known structures. Others sit off to the side, in areas that haven't been excavated because digging there would be risky for the monuments above. That's one of the central tensions at Giza. Archaeologists know there are features beneath the plateau they haven't fully explored, but they can't simply tunnel into the ground wherever they like. Carving new paths could destabilize the foundations of the pyramids, which is a trade-off no one is eager to make. So many of the suspected cavities remain unvisited, existing mostly as patterns on survey charts, hints instead of clear answers. Those hints, naturally, attract stories. If you tell people, there are voids beneath the plateau that we can see in the data, but we're not sure what they are, the imagination does what it always does. It fills in possibilities. Maybe they're old quarries. Maybe they're construction tunnels. Maybe they're natural caves. Maybe there's something more organized. The evidence doesn't insist on any single answer, so speculation grows in the empty space. But if we strip away the more dramatic ideas for a moment, the geology alone is interesting enough. Some of the cavities likely formed purely from ancient waterware. Others may be partly natural, partly expanded by human hands. Some might sit close to carved spaces made during pyramid construction, blurring the line between natural cave and man-made chamber. When modern scanning tools pick up an anomaly, researchers have to interpret whether they're seeing geology, architecture, or a mix of both. To make things even more layered, the plateau has been in use for thousands of years across multiple periods of Egyptian history. Not everything under the surface belongs to the time of the major pyramids. Some features may predate them. Others may have been added centuries later. When excavation reveals a tunnel or chamber, its style and tool marks sometimes point to a different era than we'd expect. That means the underground landscape at Giza isn't a single, unified system. It's a patchwork. Natural hollows, early cuts, later modifications, filled shafts, abandoned experiments. A lot of different decisions from a lot of different times end up stacked in the same patch of ground. From above, that complexity is invisible. The sand smooths everything. The rock hides its own internal variations. To most visitors, the plateau looks like a stable stage. The pyramids on top, nothing below except solid stone. But under that stage is a tangle of geology and history. When people hear about cavities beneath the pyramids, it's easy to leap straight to the biggest possible interpretation. Huge catacombs, vast complexes, entire hidden structures. The reality is probably more modest and more intricate at the same time. The underground world is almost certainly a mixture. Small natural caves, construction shafts, unfinished passages. carved rooms with unknown uses, and geological voids that no one ever entered. Some spaces may be connected. Others are completely isolated. Some play a role in the structural stability of the plateau. Others are just side effect of how stone, water, and time interact. In recent years, microgravity studies have suggested that some of the cavities may be loosely interconnected, not as a continuous series of tunnels, but as gaps and hollow zones inside certain layers of rock. Think of it less like a subway map and more like pockets of air inside a loaf of bread. Some touch, some don't, but they're all part of the same baked structure. When survey results show an anomaly, it's tempting to attach it to story. Chamber, tunnel, hall. But in the quiet light of a late-night thought, it can be enough just to acknowledge there's a gap there. Something that isn't solid. Something a rock is doing or has had done to it that we don't completely understand. Imagine standing on the plateau at night. The air is cooler. The crowds are gone. The pyramids are dark shapes against a sky that's just beginning to show stars. Under your feet, maybe 10 meters down, maybe 50, the rock is not uniform. Somewhere in that depth, there might be a small hollow, a natural pocket untouched since before humans existed. Somewhere else, there might be a short tunnel, half filled with rubble from an ancient construction phase. A little farther, a chamber that hasn't been entered in thousands of years, not because it hides something world-changing, but because no one has needed to open it. None of that needs to be dramatic to feel profound. It's simply the quiet reality of old landscapes. They're layered in ways the surface doesn't reveal. And once you let that idea settle, that the plateau is not a blank base, but a deep, complicated environment, the thought that the pyramids might be only the visible tops of a larger, vertical story stops feeling like a leap. It starts to feel like a natural consequence of how time, geology, and human construction stack themselves together in the same place. If you stand almost anywhere on the Giza Plateau and look toward the pyramids, one thing becomes clear quickly. Wherever you are, they feel like they're exactly where they're supposed to be. Not a few meters to the left, not farther back, not tilted at some odd angle. They sit in the landscape with the kind of confidence that makes you feel as if the land and the structures agreed on this arrangement a very long time ago. That feeling isn't just poetic. It has a lot to do with alignment. People often talk about how precisely the Great Pyramid is aligned to true north. Its sides face almost exactly north-south, east and west. For a structure built without GPS, lasers, or digital instruments, that level of accuracy is astonishing. Even today, if you gave a team simple tools and told them to match it, they'd have to work very carefully. The usual explanation is that the builders used the night sky, tracking stars, watching how they moved, and using those motions as a guide to find the cardinal directions. It's a patient process, one that requires repeated observations and a willingness to refine your measurements over time. That alone tells you something about their mindset. They care enough about orientation to spend nights watching the sky and days marking lines on stone. But the alignment story doesn't stop at the stars. The other large pyramids at Giza follow the same basic pattern. Their sides also face the cardinal directions. Their internal angles relate to one another in consistent ways. When you look from above, the three main pyramids form a layout that feels rhythmic, not chaotic, not haphazard, but balanced, as if someone was composing with shapes across the plateau. Most of the time, when we hear about alignment, we hear it framed in terms of astronomy. People talk about shafts pointing towards certain stars, or the pyramids reflecting constellations, or causeways lining up with the rising sun at certain times of year. Those are interesting connections, and they may hold pieces of truth, but if we only focus upward, we miss half the picture. Ancient Egyptian builders were just as concerned with the earth as they were with the sky. Temples weren't only aligned to celestial events. They were also oriented to the flow of the Nile, the layout of nearby settlements, and the natural features of the land. Structures lined up with hills, river bends, and other landmarks as much as with star paths. To them, alignment meant connecting heaven and earth, not choosing one over the other. At Giza, that dual concern seems to show up quietly in the relationship between the pyramids and the bedrock beneath them. If you could strip away the sand and look at the plateau as a kind of stone map, you'd see that the rock isn't random. Layers of limestone run in certain directions. Natural ridges trace long, subtle lines. Some of those lines, the strongest, most stable ones, run in directions very close to the cardinal axes. Building along those lines makes sense. If you place a heavy structure so that its base is on a strong, continuous ridge of rock, the weight spreads more evenly. The ground is less likely to crack or shift under pressure. It's as if the earth itself provides a set of support beams, long before any human design enters the picture. When the pyramids align to north, south, east, and west, their sides don't just match the sky. They also seem to match some of these underlying patterns in the stone. The same orientation that lets them speak to the stars also helps them cooperate with the geology. So alignment becomes more than a symbolic gesture. It becomes a practical tool. If the builders oriented the pyramids to both celestial and geological markers, they weren't just placing monuments. They were embedding their structures into the natural framework of the plateau. The result is something that feels strangely inevitable. The pyramids don't look like they've been placed on a land. They look like they've grown out of it. The relationship between the pyramids themselves adds another layer to this. If each pyramid had been a standalone project, started from scratch with no reference to its neighbors, we'd expect their positioning to vary more. But their spacing follows proportions that repeat when you measure them in different ways. The distances between their bases, the angles of their slopes, even their heights appear to follow ratios that relate to each other. Researchers who study ancient surveying methods have suggested that the builders might have laid out a kind of grid on the plateau before construction, a system of reference lines that guided where everything would go: pyramids, temples, causeways, maybe even underground features. Not a modern grid with neatly numbered squares, but a network of measured lines that tied the whole site together. If that's true, then alignment doesn't just link the pyramids to the sky. It links them to each other and to the ground. You can see hints of this when you look at other structures on the plateau. The causeway from the Khafre pyramid lines up in interesting ways with the Sphinx and nearby temples. The smaller satellite pyramids sit at distances and angles that feel too consistent to be improvised. Valley temples at the lower edge of the plateau correspond with the paths that stretch up toward the main pyramids. If you could draw all those alignments at once, between pyramids, along causeways, across the plateau, down to the temples, you'd end up with a web of lines and intersections. It would look cluttered on paper, but on the ground it would feel like a coherent whole because the lines don't collide randomly. They reinforce each other. This is where the underground features start to feel even more interesting. Some of the known shafts and tunnels beneath the plateau run in straight lines that echo the alignments above. Certain chambers sit almost exactly on the central axis of the pyramids above them. When scans pick up new voids, those voids occasionally fall along extensions of lines connected to surface structures. It's not perfect. Some underground anomalies don't match anything. Some corridors curve unexpectedly or stop short. But enough points seem to line up that it raises a quiet possibility. Maybe the same alignment principles that govern the surface also whisper their way into the stone below. The builders also appear to have loved redundancy, building more support, more structure, more hidden features than were strictly necessary for basic function. The relieving chambers are one example. Sealed shafts that don't serve obvious, everyday purposes are another. Their system of alignment might have worked the same way, not only for visual impact, but for structural security. A chamber placed beneath a pyramid along its central axis, for example, doesn't just make symbolic sense.
Internal chambers
it makes engineering
that could survive
sense.
under
It
the
sits where
weight
force
of
is
millions
balanced.
of tons
A shaft that
of
drops
stone.
a particular point along a measured line might mark more than one thing at once. A structural sweet spot, a reference point for other measurements, a link in a grid that organizes both what we see and what we don't. Imagine a spine running from the tip of a pyramid down through its center into the bedrock. On either side of that spine, weight distributes. Along that spine, builders might align chambers, passageways, and even underground features. Not because they were chasing mystery, but because they were following practical geometry. If they were already thinking in those terms, if they treated alignment as a tool for stability as much as for symbolism, then extending that logic into the ground beneath the pyramids wouldn't have felt like a leap. It would have felt like a continuation. That doesn't mean there's a perfect, mirror reflection of each pyramid carved below the surface. The underground environment is messier than that. Natural cavities cut across human plans. Geological boundaries limit where you can safely carve. Construction needs change mid-project. But under all that noise, the same quiet pattern seems to peek through again and again. Align, measure, anchor. The pyramids may point upward, but they anchor downward. Their orientations tie them to the sky, but also to the deep, slow structure of the earth. Their positions organize the way the plateau feels, above and below. When you think of alignment in that broader sense, the idea that the pyramids are just a visible part of something larger, something that includes a bedrock and whatever spaces it contains, stops sounding like a big claim. It starts sounding like a gentle way of saying that these structures were never meant to be only surfaces. They were meant to be part of a full environment, woven into the land from top to bottom, with their most visible edges pointing at the stars and their quietest edges resting in the dark, unseen layers of stone below. For as long as people have been looking at the pyramids, they've been trying to imagine what might lie beneath them. Long before ground-penetrating radar, long before seismic surveys and careful cross-sections, the earliest visitors were already weaving their own maps in their minds. Maps made of stories. Those stories almost always pointed in the same direction, down. The ancient Egyptians themselves didn't tend to write openly about the hidden workings of sacred sites. A lot of what they knew stayed in the hands of priests, scribes, and builders. That silence created space. And in that space, even in antiquity, stories started to grow around Giza. When Greek travelers came to Egypt and saw the pyramids, they did what humans always do when faced with something overwhelming. They asked the locals what was inside. The answers they got weren't engineering reports. They were fragments of legend, bits of religious symbolism, secondhand recollections from guides whose own understanding may have been shaped as much by myth as by memory. Some of the earliest written accounts from Greek authors describe elaborate underground chambers connected to the Nile by canals, or labyrinthine spaces beneath the pyramids where kings were hidden away from time and disaster. Herodotus, often called the father of history, wrote about subterranean rooms that sounded more like something out of a dream than a field report, watery corridors, secret chambers, carefully concealed spaces where the line between practicality and symbolism blurs. Modern historians look at those accounts with a lot of skepticism. The details don't line up with what we've actually found. But if you step back from the specifics and listen to the direction of those stories, they're all doing the same thing, assuming that what stands on the surface is only half the picture. The idea of beneath was already attached to the pyramids thousands of years ago. As time went on, new layers of myth built themselves on top of the old ones. Later writers described underground halls filled with scrolls, mechanical traps, or treasures protected from floods and fire. Medieval travelers told stories of secret doors cut into the bedrock, tunnels stretching for miles, chambers sealed by curses. Many of those tales sound like the kind of thing you'd tell around a fire, half warning, half wonder. What's interesting isn't whether those stories are literally true. It's that they all spiral back toward the same instinct. That these structures, so heavy and precise and enduring, must have roots that go deeper than what you can see. Myths usually start with some kind of observation. People see a depression in the ground, a blocked entrance, a shaft that disappears into darkness. They see workers going into places they can't follow. They notice that the rock around a monument has been cut or altered in ways they don't understand. In the absence of diagrams and technical explanations, the mind does what it's wired to do. It fills in the gaps. If you grow up hearing that a site is sacred, that it's connected to gods or the realm of the dead, beneath quickly becomes more than just physical depth. It becomes symbolic depth, the place where the unseen lives. Over generations, that symbolic underworld can easily turn into a literal one in people's imaginations. A phrase about knowledge being hidden under the earth can slowly transform into a story about actual underground libraries beneath the pyramids. So you end up with legends that talk about hidden archives, buried wisdom, and secret spaces that will only be revealed at the end of the world. The myths don't need to be accurate to do their job. Their job is to hold a feeling that there's more here than we can immediately understand. Even the Sphinx, sitting slightly apart from the main pyramids, collects its own version of these stories. People have speculated for centuries about passages beneath its paws, chambers under its body, tunnels that link it to the pyramids behind. Early explorers reported finding small cavities and cut spaces in the rock around it. Later archaeological work confirmed at least some of those. Nothing like the vast complexes of legend, but enough to show that, yes, there are carved features and natural hollows beneath the surface. In other words, the land really does contain gaps. They're just not as theatrical as the stories make them sound. And that's the pattern you see again and again. The myths exaggerate the scale, but they often get the direction right. They say, there's something down there, not necessarily. There's a city down there. When modern scanning technology finds a new void inside a pyramid or beneath the plateau, people sometimes latch onto it as confirmation of the old tales. See? They were right all along. But what's really happening is quieter. The scans aren't proving the myths. They're explaining why those myths felt reasonable in the first place. If villagers 1,000 years ago saw shafts going into the rock and heard that no one knows exactly where they lead, of course they'd imagine large spaces below. If they watched explorers vanish into narrow entrances and emerge hours later, they'd naturally assume the underground world was extensive. When you can't see the limits of something, you tend to assume it's big. That instinct isn't foolish. It's deeply human. In a way, the myths around Giza were the earliest version of what we're doing tonight. They were people trying to connect a visible structure with an invisible one. They didn't have scans or surveys or careful excavation reports. So they used stories as tools to explore the unknown. We might look at those stories now and say, well, that's not quite how it works. But we're still responding to the same feeling, that these monuments stand at the edge of something we don't fully grasp, both in the ground beneath them and in the minds of the people who built them. There's another twist to this. Ancient Egyptian texts themselves often use metaphor when talking about sacred spaces. Descriptions of hidden rooms beneath the earth might not have been meant literally. They could have been referring to spiritual ideas, realms of the dead, stages of a journey after life. When those symbolic phrases pass into other cultures, or persisted through time without full context, they could easily turn into literal claims about physical chambers. Symbol becomes structure, metaphor becomes map. So we end up in a curious position. On one side, there are modern tools and careful measurements, showing us that yes, the plateau contains cavities, shafts, and unexpected voids. On the other side, there are myths and legends that talk about underground spaces in grand, dramatic terms. Somewhere between those two lies a quieter truth. The underground world is real, but it's made of geology, construction, and time, not magic. The interesting thing is that the myths don't go away when we learn more. They change shape when a new void is detected. The old stories flare up again for a moment, then slowly adjust to new information. The tale of a massive underground city might soften into the idea of an extensive network of smaller spaces. The legend of a hidden library might shrink into the much more modest,
hollows in the rock
but still powerful idea of sealed chambers that haven't been open since the time of their builders.
But the very questions
and maybe
we
that's
ask
okay,
about it.
because at their core, these stories aren't really about what's in the pyramids. They're about how humans respond to places that feel bigger than our usual explanations. They're the narrative shadow cast by monuments that have stood for longer than any single culture's memory. They're one more layer in the same stack that holds geology, architecture, and all the quiet questions we still carry. The pyramids stand. The ground beneath them holds more complexity than we can see. And in the space between what is known and what isn't, myths settle in like mist, not as enemies of truth, but as early, imperfect attempts to describe the same sense of depth we're exploring now, slowly, one thought at a time. When people today describe the pyramids as almost impossible, they don't usually mean that literally. They mean something closer to, I know it's technically possible, but my brain has trouble connecting what I see to the tools they had. On one side, you have a reality. Millions of stone blocks, precisely angled faces, internal chambers lined with massive granite beams, and foundations that have held steady for thousands of years. On the other side, you have the toolkit. Copper chisels, wooden sleds, stone hammers, ropes, levers, and human hands. No steel, no cranes, no engines, no concrete mixers. Just patient effort and a very stubborn understanding of geometry. Modern engineers sometimes admit Not that they couldn't rebuild a pyramid, but that recreating one using only the original methods would be extremely challenging. Not because those methods are some lost mystical technology, but because they're unfamiliar to us now. We don't organize labor that way anymore. We don't think in terms of thousands of people committing decades to a single structure that doesn't generate profit or data. That gap between familiarity and reality is where a lot of the quiet mystery around Giza lives. The starting point is measurement. The precision of the pyramids isn't an accident. The builders measured, checked, and measured again. One common explanation is that they use simple tools. Things like plumb lines, set squares, and rods of standard length, combined with careful observation of the sun and stars. With enough time, you can get incredibly accurate results out of simple methods. Track a star's position against a vertical line night after night, and you can pin down north with surprising precision. Lay out ropes with knots at equal intervals, and you can create consistent ratios over very large distances. None of that requires advanced devices. It demands patience, repetition, and a culture that takes measurement seriously. Stone cutting, especially for limestone, also fits that pattern. Copper chisels dull quickly, but they can still do the job if you have systems in place for constant sharpening and replacement. For harder stones like granite, you can use pounding stone, sand abrasion, and primitive drills powered by rotating a shaft back and forth with a bow or rope. It's slow, but it works. The key is scaling those methods up. A single person with a copper chisel can't do much against a huge block of stone. Hundreds of workers, trained and organized, can. Day after day, year after year, they turn repetitive actions into precise results. Where modern thinking tries to maximize the efficiency of each tool, ancient builders often maximize the total effort of the whole system. You can see that mindset in the uniformity of the blocks. Many stones in the pyramids appear to have been cut to standard sizes. That doesn't just make stacking easier. It suggests a kind of mass production. Workers in quarries shaping stones according to known dimensions, knowing those blocks will fit into pre-planned rows and layers. If you imagine them using a consistent measuring unit across the entire site, including for underground cuts and trenches, then the subterranean features stop looking like random experiments. They become part of the same measuring culture. The same system that governs the height of a chamber might also define the depth of a shaft or the width of a trench cut into the bedrock. Transporting the stones is another place where simple techniques multiplied by scale can feel contradictory to the results. The classic image of workers dragging blocks across the desert on wooden sleds is basically correct, but experiments have shown that if you wet the sand in front of the sled, the friction drops significantly. Archaeologists even found an ancient painting showing workers pouring water in front of a sled. A tiny detail that quietly explains a lot. Moving heavy objects over ramps, straight or zigzagging, is exhausting, but not magical. With enough time and enough people, you can slowly slide and lever blocks upward. Temporary scaffolding, packing stones beneath as you raise each piece a little at a time, can lift even the heaviest beams into place. The big granite beams above the king's chamber are a good example. They weigh tens of tons each and sit high inside the structure. Lifting them with no crane sounds impossible until you break it into steps. Car the beam, transport along the ground, move it partway up the structure using ramps, then slowly jack it higher by levering one side, inserting support stones, then the other, repeating over and over until it reaches its final position. The process is dangerous and slow, but slow and dangerous is different from impossible. The builders weren't in a hurry. Their timeline wasn't measured in quarters or fiscal years. It was measured in lifetimes. What makes all of this especially interesting in the context of what lies beneath the pyramids is that the same kind of thinking applies to the underground world. Carving a descending passage into the bedrock at a precise angle isn't fundamentally more mysterious than carving a smooth external face. It uses the same tools, the same measurements, the same patience. Only this time directed downward instead of upward. Creating a small chamber deep in the rock requires careful planning to avoid collapse. But the principles are the same ones used to keep chambers inside the pyramid safe under immense weight. In a way, the underground features are where the builder's understanding of stone shows most clearly. They had to know how the rock would respond to cuts, how to shape ceilings so they wouldn't crack, how to position spaces so that the pressure from millions of tons above would bypass them rather than squeeze directly onto them. That's the same logic behind the relieving chambers. It's the same logic behind the step cuts in the bedrock under the pyramids. Redirect weight, control stress, give forces somewhere to go. Seen from this angle, the subterranean side of Giza isn't a mysterious add-on. It's a natural extension of the same engineering mindset that shaped the visible monuments. The builders weren't just stacking stone for show. They were creating a tightly integrated system. Foundations, internal chambers, hidden support structures, carved bedrock, and possibly additional spaces below, all working together. There's another quiet irony here. The pyramids are so massive and dense that modern scanning tools still struggle to see clearly through them. Particles used to probe the interior get absorbed or deflected. Signals bounce in complicated ways inside the thick stone. What the builders created using simple tools is, in some areas, hard for advanced tools to fully penetrate. So you have an odd situation, an ancient structure built without machines, capable of resisting not just erosion and earthquakes, but also our attempts to look effortlessly through it. That resistance doesn't mean there's something supernatural going on. It just highlights how rare it is for anything humans build to be this solid for this long. Most of our modern buildings are light, thin, and designed with maintenance in mind. The pyramids were built to endure. They don't need servicing. They don't care who's trying to measure them. They just sit, hundreds of millions of stone blocks locked together, quietly letting our scans skim their surfaces and speculate about their depths. When people talk about lost technology in this context, the thing that's really lost isn't a machine. It's a way of organizing effort, a willingness to commit huge numbers of people to a single, slow, precise project, a cultural decision to build something that outlasts everyone involved by such a margin that even the reasons behind certain choices become mysterious. That mindset is what allows for the possibility that underground spaces exist that we don't fully understand. Not because they were meant to hide cosmic secrets, but because the planning that created them wasn't documented for us. It was lived and buried inside stone and time. So when you hear that there are unexplored voids beneath the plateau or shafts whose full depth we don't yet know, you can hold two thoughts at once. One, the builders didn't need mythical technology to make those features. They needed the same tools they used everywhere else: stone, copper, rope, patience, and a deep familiarity with how rock behaves. Two, the very scale of what they built and the density of the stone they used now limits how easily we can explore those features without risking damage to the monuments above. In a strange, quiet way, the pyramids are protecting their own underworld, not through curses or traps, but through the simple fact of being so solid that every attempt to look deeper has to weigh curiosity against caution, and that, more than anything, might be the most unexpected part of this whole story. That something built with such straightforward tools can still, thousands of years later, gently hold on to parts of itself that we can only outline in scans and imagine in the dark. When you start thinking about the pyramids not just as objects, but as parts of a larger engineered environment, your attention starts to slide away from the stones themselves and toward the land they sit on. The Giza Plateau stops feeling like a neutral stage and starts to look more like an invisible partner in the design. From the surface, the plateau seems simple: a steady rise above the floodplain, some level ground, some rocky outcrops, then desert stretching away. But geologists describe it as a stack of ancient seas turned to stone. Layers of limestone laid down over millions of years, pressed together, cracked, lifted, and reshaped long before anyone imagined carving them. Some of those layers are tough, dense, and reliable. Others are softer, more easily worn away. Some hold fossil traces of old marine life. Some hide small pockets and channels carved by water in a different climate. The result is not one big flat slab, but a landscape with a built-in structure, natural shelves, ridges, and steps waiting quietly beneath the sand. For an ancient builder who understood rock, that kind of landscape would be full of potential. They wouldn't just ask, "Can we build here?" They'd ask, "What is this particular piece of ground good at? Where does it hold weight well? Where does it crumble? Where does it offer an easy cut for a passage? Where does it require reinforcement?" At Giza, the answer appears to be that certain zones of the plateau were almost tailor-made for enormous, long-lasting stone projects. High, solid ridges where dense limestone sits near the surface. Natural ledges that could be trimmed flat with less effort. Areas where the rock underneath forms a kind of buried pedestal. The Great Pyramid takes advantage of exactly that kind of spot. It doesn't rest on a tidy rectangle of man-made blocks alone. Large portions of its base are carved directly into bedrock. The builders sliced, leveled, and stepped the limestone until it formed a foundation that's part natural geology, part human geometry. The same technique appears at the neighboring pyramids. Different details, same principle. In some places, the bedrock under those structures is cut so cleanly and so precisely that early researchers mistook it for intentionally placed stonework. Only later did they realize they were looking at sculpted earth, not separate blocks. The line between ground and building grows thin. This is one of those small, quiet details that changes the way the whole site feels. The pyramids aren't just sitting on the plateau. They are, in a very literal way, plugged into it. Elsewhere across the site, long trenches carved into the rock outline rectangles, and corridors that mirror shapes above ground. Some of these look like reverse footprints of the monuments, negative forms pressed into stone, like the first strokes of a sketch under a painting. Others appear as long, straight cuts that could have served as construction guides or reference lines. Imagine stripping away all the sand and later debris, leaving only rock. You'd see those cuts everywhere. Long channels, shallow depressions, level platforms, the rough edges of quarries. The plateau would look less like untouched nature and more like a huge, open-air workshop where the first draft of the pyramids were drawn at full scale. That image matters when you think about what might lie beneath. The underground world at Giza isn't some separate layer that begins at a magic depth. It's tangled up with this reshaped surface, trenches that lead to deeper cuts, quarries that become cavities, carved outlines that hint at spaces underfoot. Some features that are now hidden may once have been open. Trenches that today are filled with sand might once have revealed edges of lower layers. Access shafts we can only see at the top now might have been part of a more extensive network of working routes during construction, paths that were later sealed as the final layout took shape. It's not hard to imagine that some of those routes led deeper into the rock, and then simply dropped out of use as the project evolved. No dramatic secret, just the quiet leftover pieces of a long, complicated job. What makes the plateau at Giza feel especially intentional is how consistently the builders seem to have avoided its weaker zones. There are parts of the underlying rock that are more fractured, more filled with old water channels or softer layers. You don't find the biggest, heaviest structures sitting there. Instead, those areas are either left alone or used in ways that don't demand as much stability. That pattern gives you a glimpse of just how closely the ancient planners must have watched the land. They weren't just building on the plateau. They were building with it. And that cooperation shows up even in places most visitors never think about. The paths the causeways take as they run from the valley temples by the old river edge up toward the pyramids. Those long stone ramps don't just point wherever they like. They follow routes that seem to respect both symbolic alignment and the contours of the ground, tracing arcs that avoid steep drops or unstable zones. So when someone says, maybe the pyramids are just a visible part of something larger, they're not necessarily talking about hidden cities or vast subterranean labs. They might simply be noticing that the whole site, surface, subsurface, and surrounding desert, behaves like one big, interconnected design. The more you sit with that idea, the more you start to notice another layer, not in the rock this time, but in us. Because for all the geology and engineering, part of what makes Giza feel larger than itself is the way we react to it. Even if you approach the pyramids with a strictly scientific mindset, some part of you still registers the feeling of standing in front of something that has outlived entire languages. Something that has watched human culture reinvent itself again and again and stayed. That feeling, awe, or something near it, is what pulls a lot of people toward the idea that there must be more. More rooms, more chambers, more purpose, more meaning. Our minds don't like the idea that this strange, intense reaction comes only from shapes and stones. We look for depth to match what we feel. If the structure feels enormous, we want its story to be equally enormous. If it feels impossibly stable, we imagine equally powerful motives behind its construction. If it feels like the tip of something, our thoughts automatically run downwards, trying to fill in a rest. That's part why stories about underground complexes, hidden archives, or lost chambers catch on so easily, even among people who know how rare it is for reality to match those images. The emotions of pyramids stir up want an outlet. The unknown beneath the plateau provides one, but there's a quieter way to look at it. Instead of thinking, there must be something big down there, you can think, of course there's something down there, not necessarily extraordinary, but layered, complicated, and old. Natural cavities, ancient quarry cuts, sealed tunnels, half-forgotten chambers, changes in the geology itself. Together they form a kind of subdued, real underground landscape, not a hidden world designed to shock us, but a slow accumulation of choices and processes that ended up stacked beneath the pyramids while no one was watching. The remarkable thing is that you don't have to exaggerate any of it for the sight to feel deep. Even the most modest possibilities, a small chamber that hasn't been opened since it was sealed, a natural hollow no human has ever entered, a trench in the bedrock that once guided construction, are enough to give the ground a kind of quiet richness. You can sit with that and feel a sense of scale that doesn't depend on revelation, just a knowledge that under the surface you see on a postcard, there are other surfaces, older cuts, older layers, older spaces, all resting in darkness, doing nothing dramatic, simply existing. And somehow, that calm version of more can be just as satisfying as the most elaborate legend. Maybe more so. It asks nothing of you except patience and a willingness to accept that some details will remain out of reach. The pyramids will keep standing whether we map every cavity beneath them or not. The plateau will keep its own rhythms as the sand shifts a little each year. Our technology will improve. We'll learn more. We'll redraw our diagrams and update our models. But even then, it's unlikely that every corner of the subsurface will be fully explored. Not because it's impossible, but because of cost, in effort, in risk to the monuments, in disturbance to the site, will always have to be balanced against the quiet value of leaving some things as they are. And that means the idea we've been circling all this time may always have a place to live. The general sense that what we see of the pyramids is only part of their story, and that beneath the stone our eyes can reach, more layers of rock and history and human intention continue downward, unhurried, into the dark. Whenever you stand in front of something that has outlived entire civilizations, there's a particular kind of feeling that creeps in, even if you're not thinking about it in poetic terms. You don't have to be spiritual or romantic or especially interested in history. There's just something about being in the presence of a structure that has watched languages die, borders move, beliefs rise and fade, and yet barely change itself. The pyramids do that to almost everyone, even if they'd never use a word like awe for it. You can go in with a very rational mindset. Okay, this is limestone. These are measured angles. This is a product of labor and planning. And all of that is true. But at the same time, some quieter part of you is processing a different message. Whatever human life is, it's brief compared to this. That contrast between your own timeline and the monument's timeline lands somewhere deep and wordless. You feel small, but not necessarily in a bad way. More like you've just been reminded that you live inside a very long story. When that feeling hits, the mind starts looking for context big enough to match it. If the pyramids feel enormous, then their meaning must be enormous, too. If the engineering feels beyond what we're used to seeing from the distant past, then the intentions behind it must be equally far-reaching. If the site feels larger than the physical stones we can see, we naturally imagine a purpose or a hidden layer that stretches just as far as the feeling. Humans have done this with big things for a very long time. Mountains become the homes of gods. Storms become battles between unseen beings. Ancient ruins become the work of giants or lost cultures that knew secret things. None of this is stupidity. It's just what happens when the emotional impact of a place outruns the information we have about it. Our imaginations rush in to close the gap. The pyramids sit right in that gap. They look simple on the surface. For sloping sides, a point, stone upon stone. But underneath that simplicity is an avalanche of questions. Why this shape? Why the scale? Why here? Why so precise? Why so durable? Why so much care for what lies both inside and beneath? Even when archaeology gives reasonable answers, The feeling that there should be more doesn't completely go away. And then there's the worldview of the people who built them. The ancient Egyptians didn't draw hard lines between physical and symbolic. A tomb wasn't just a place to store a body. It was a gateway. A temple wasn't just a hall. It was a kind of cosmic address where a god lived on earth. The pyramids weren't just massive piles of stone. They were tied up with ideas about the afterlife, the sun, rebirth, order, continuity. They were architecture and metaphor at the same time. Later cultures inherited fragments of those meanings without the full context. Over centuries, stories layer themselves onto the site. Some emphasize religion, some power, some hidden knowledge. With each new era, the pyramids became a kind of blank screen for people to project their deepest fascinations onto: salvation, secrets, lost wisdom, ancient science. The sand around them changed. The myths around them changed. The stone stayed. Even now, in a world full of satellites and data and instant answers, people still arrive at Giza and feel that tug towards something bigger. You can see in the questions they ask, not just how did they do this, but what were they really doing here? Or what are we missing? That really carries a lot of weight. It hints at an emotional expectation, that a creation this intense deserves a meaning equally intense. That's part of why the idea of something larger beneath the pyramids is so sticky. It fits neatly into the shape of the feeling. The visible stones give you the first layer. The unseen ground gives you a second. The mind says, that's better. Now the physical depth matches the emotional depth. You can see this pattern not just in casual visitors, but in the way stories react to new discoveries. When a scan reveals a new void, very few people imagine a small, awkward cavity. They imagine a hidden chamber. When someone mentions unexplored shafts, the first thought usually isn't maintenance corridors. It's lost rooms. Even when the evidence remains cautious, the imagination leaps ahead, trying to draw a conclusion that feels right. Scientists aren't immune to any of this. They may be trained to bracket their feelings while they work, but they still stand in the same desert, under the same heat, looking at the same impossible geometry. They still have moments alone with the stones, when the project isn't data analysis, but simply being here. When a fresh anomaly appears in the measurements, they know it might be nothing dramatic, and yet some small, human part of them still wonders. That's not a flaw in the research. It's just a reminder that even the most careful investigation lives inside a very human experience. We don't study the pyramids from a distance. We study them while standing in their shadow. This emotional response also explains why the pyramids keep their place in our cultural imagination, even with so many other wonders in the world. Skyscrapers are taller. Dams and bridges push engineering in other wild directions. But we know who sign off on those projects. We have the blueprints, the time-lapse videos, the manuals. They fit easily into our sense of how things are done. The pyramids don't. The people who designed them didn't leave us notebooks of calculations. We don't have the conversations they had about why a passage should slope at this angle instead of that one, why a chamber should sit here instead of there, or how much they thought about the cavities in the rock beneath their feet. We're left with the finished product and fragments of context. That absence of direct explanation leaves a lot of open space. Space that modern minds fill with theories, stories, and quiet guesses. If you look at Giza from this angle, the site becomes as much psychological as physical. The stones are real, the geology is real, the underground anomalies are real. But so is the way we respond to them. The pyramids didn't just shape the plateau. They've also spent thousands of years shaping human imagination. That's why completely solving them might not even remove the mystery. If someone could, tomorrow, map every chamber, tunnel, and cavity under the plateau without touching a grain of sand, there would still be questions left over. We might know the exact layout, but we still wouldn't hear the builders' voices. We'd still be guessing at exactly what they were thinking, how they felt about their work, what they hoped would happen when someone like you or me stood here so many centuries later. And so the pyramids will continue to do what they've always done. Sit in the middle of the desert, balancing the known and the unknown. The above-ground stones would remain impressively mapped. The below-ground layers would be better understood. But the human part, the awe, the urge to imagine something more, The feeling that the site stretches deeper than any scan can capture. That would stay. There's something unexpectedly gentle about accepting that. You don't have to pick a side between its all mundane geology and engineering, and there must be something wildly hidden that rewrites everything. You can let the physical facts be what they are: dense stone, layered rock, some unexplored cavities, traces of old tunnels and chambers. And you can let your sense of wonder exist alongside those facts without needing it to turn into proof of anything dramatic. In that balance, the idea that the pyramids might only be the surface of something larger becomes less of a claim and more of a feeling. Larger not just in the literal sense of chambers extending downward, but in the sense that the site reaches into parts of our minds that numbers and diagrams don't fully touch. The stones speak one language. The ground beneath them speaks another. And the part of you that keeps listening, long after the explanations have ended, speaks a third, the language of, I may never know everything here, and somehow I'm okay with that. At a certain point in this kind of journey, after you wander through the stone, the geology, the old stories, the technology, and all the quiet engineering that holds these structures together, something starts to soften. The pyramids stop feeling like a problem you're supposed to solve. They start feeling more like a place you're simply allowed to spend time with. It's a bit like walking through a museum and realizing you're not actually trying to memorize dates anymore. You're just standing in front of an object, letting it exist, and letting yourself exist beside it. The same thing can happen with the pyramids, especially if you imagine yourself not in the heat of midday, but in that gentler moment when the desert begins to cool. Picture the plateau in the late evening, the crowds thinning, the sound of voices drifting away, the air losing that sharp daytime edge and turning softer, almost empty. The horizon darkens slowly instead of suddenly. The pyramids slide from bright shapes into darker silhouettes, outlines against a sky that's holding on to the last of the light. From a distance, they look simpler at that hour. Not so many visible blocks, not so much detail. Just clean, dark lines meeting at the top, their edges blurring slightly as the light fades. They don't look like puzzles. They look like markers of time, of effort, of endurance. And underneath them, the same bedrock we've been talking about is still there, doing exactly what it's done for thousands of years, carrying the weight quietly, without needing to be seen. When you bring your attention back to that hidden side, the layers of limestone, the carved steps, the natural pockets, the buried cuts, it stops feeling like a dramatic secret and starts feeling like something much more ordinary and somehow more comforting. An underground world made not of revelations, but of accumulated moments. Water wearing channels into rock long before anyone arrived. Workers carving trenches and shafts that are now filled and forgotten. Sand sliding year after year into low places, sealing gaps and covering tool marks. All of it happening slowly enough that no one living through it would have called it remarkable, yet taken together. It's exactly what gives the site its depth. People sometimes talk about hidden worlds beneath the sands as if they're separate realms. But in reality, those worlds can be small. A chamber sealed and untouched for 3,000 or 4,000 years is its own kind of hidden world. A natural cavity no human has ever entered is another. A tunnel started, then abandoned when plans change, is another. None of them need to be huge to feel meaningful. Their significance comes from time, not size. If you strip away the big expectations and think simply in terms of layers, the whole idea of the pyramids being only the surface of something larger becomes easier to hold in a calm way. The visible stones are one layer. The shaped bedrock beneath them is another. The natural geology below, that is another. The traces of old quarries and construction spaces are another. The myths and stories and emotional reactions we've built on top of all of it, those are layers too, just less physical. You don't have to imagine a massive hidden structure to accept that what you see is just one part of a deeper environment. Any place that's old, shaped by both nature and people, is going to have more beneath the surface than above it, in one sense or another. If you imagine the plateau thousands of years ago, before the sand rose and settled the way it is now, that layering becomes easier to picture. Quarries open along the rock faces. Terraces are cut, then expanded. Workers move in and out of trenches that are now half buried. Shallow depressions expose older layers of stone that today are hidden. Open cavities that once echoed with footsteps are now sealed by collapsed rock or drifting sediment. Back then, parts of the underground would have been visible. What we now think of as mysterious, they might have taken for granted. An exposed cut here, a hollow there, shafts with ropes hanging down into them. Over time, long after the builders were gone, the wind and sand did what they always do in the desert, slowly erase the edges. Features that were once ordinary parts of a work site slipped quietly into the category of unknown. Today, that unknown is what our attention gravitates to, not because we're desperate for something unbelievable, but because the site itself feels incomplete if we only look at the top layer. There's something almost restful in realizing that the hidden side of the plateau doesn't have to be extraordinary to be worth thinking about. It just has to be real, layers of rock, evidence of old work, geological quirks, and a handful of spaces we haven't reached yet, all resting under the same sand. When you hold it that way, curiosity doesn't disappear, but it changes tempo. It's no longer a frantic, "What are they hiding down there?" but a slower, gentler, "What else might have happened here that we haven't fully traced yet?" The pyramids themselves mirror that feeling. Up close, the blocks are sharp, the edge is strong, the effort obvious. From farther away, they get quieter. At night, when they're mostly reduced to outline and shadow, they start to feel less like projects and more like presences. Things that are simply there and have been there for a very long time. If you imagine sitting on the sand a short distance away, the ground cool beneath your hands, the last warmth leaving the stone, the sky darkening, the pyramid's just shapes now. No facts, no diagrams, no cross-sections. The idea of what lies beneath shifts again. It stops feeling like a riddle. It starts feeling like a simple truth about old places. There's always more underneath than you can see. Not necessarily more in the sense of huge discoveries waiting just below your feet, but more in the sense of layers of history and geology and human activity compacted together into something the surface can only hint at. The unseen becomes less like a secret and more like a foundation. The ground beneath the pyramids doesn't just hide things, it supports everything above it. The unknown down, there is not only a question mark, it's also the reason the stones still stand. Thinking about it that way turns a mystery upside down. Instead of asking, what are they concealing below, you begin to ask, how much had to happen below, in the rock, in the planning, in the carving, so that these structures can stand as calmly now? The answer is a lot, more than we've fully mapped, possibly more than we'll ever completely reconstruct. And that's okay. The human mind likes to chase closure, but not everything old and impressive exists to be finally, totally explained. Some things are allowed to remain partly obscure, not because they're hiding some world-changing revelation, but because time, rock, and practical limits will always keep parts of them just out of reach. The desert will keep doing what deserts do, covering, uncovering, shifting edges, revealing a little here and burying a little there. Researchers will keep learning more, adding quiet details to the picture. New scans will show new anomalies. Some will turn out to be important. Others will turn out to be disappointingly ordinary. All of them will belong to the same layered place. And in the middle of that slow process, the pyramids will remain what they've gradually become for us over thousands of years. Not just architectural achievements, not just geological curiosities, but companions to our curiosity itself. They stand at the border between what we know and what we don't. Without demanding that we cross it, they let us ask big questions without insisting on big answers. They give us something solid to look at while our thoughts wander into places we can't measure. So if you picture the plateau one last time, the stone, the sand, the dark interior spaces, the cavities in the rock, the unseen cuts buried far below, the mist floating above it all, you can let one small, steady idea settle in. The pyramids are the tops of something larger. Not necessarily a hidden structure, but a layered reality of earth, of effort, of time, and of the way human beings keep returning to the same place in their minds again and again to wonder. And the fact that some of those layers will always stay under the surface doesn't make the story incomplete. It's part of what makes it peaceful.